world, across from Australia to America. Um, and we're going to talk about issues that affect both the global south and the global north. And as we go into this, one of the things that that sticks in my head is Mike Pompeo talking about WikiLeaks being a hostile non-state intelligence service. And it seems quite apt that it was this hostile non-state intelligence service that was supposedly abetting the government of Russia that 9 years ago, through the ingenuity of people like Julian Assange and those who were behind WikiLeaks, brought to light the way in which a private, unaccountable firm was essentially engaging in all kinds of activity, including bribery and manipulation, and would literally stop at nothing, including in order to boost its bottom line, so that it kept information a privileged commodity that was only available to the few. And this was, of course, highly manipulated, tailored information. And rather than a source of knowledge and information for the many, which is what WikiLeaks sought to do. And WikiLeaks, of course, did this through being pioneering in offering what was an electronic Dropbox, so to speak, for whistleblowers that provided anonymity both to the source as well as a certain level of security for the documentation, a level of security that means that to this day, WikiLeaks has 100% record of accuracy. In contrast, what this private intelligence firm, Stratfor, was doing was providing information to governments, to the Marines, to lots of quite dubious regimes around the world, as well as to companies like Dow Chemicals. And for example, with Dow, they were reporting information in relation to activists who were reeling from the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, in Madhya Pradesh, where so many people, over 500,000 people, were injured as a result of a gas leak. And I always remember the story of this particular trade unionist, a worker who was carrying a gas called phosgene in a container and managed to drop it on himself and then pulled off the mask, the gas mask that he was wearing, and died within 72 hours of inhaling this information. Now, not only was Dow involved in this huge tragedy which went under the Union Carbide overhanging company, but it also was involved in contaminating the water after that. And Stratfor was also involved in relation to the Vancouver Olympics on advising Coca-Cola about PETA activists and what they were involved in. So for those of you who are activists sitting in the audience wondering what Julian Assange's case has to do with you, a lot of what WikiLeaks revealed was about the ways in which governments and private actors were colluding to essentially clamp down on activism, on whistleblowing, on the public's right to know. Now, Stratfor quite interestingly describes itself, and I'm trying to read the words here, as the world's leading geopolitical intelligence platform. And this world-leading geopolitical intelligence platform is actually trying to make money for a small bunch of shareholders. And it is actually public money that is being used in the pursuit of many of the activities that Stratfor is trying to get into, which are quite, to a large extent, disconnected from the socio-political and economic realities of the jurisdictions in which companies like Stratfor operate. In a way, what they do is entrench some of the structural inequalities, including racism, that comes from the kinds of perverted information that is leaked in relation to some of these sources. And when governments and intelligence agencies and public bodies rely on this kind of information, which is flawed, biased, and often inaccurate. And where the customers of this information within these governments often become assets, often become people who work within intelligence firms like Stratfor, it creates a situation where the people who are using this information, or the people who are providing this information, are largely unaccountable to the ordinary public while benefiting hugely from public money. And this is something that many of you, especially those of you who are interested in holding the state accountable for its criminality, will be really interested in. So I'd like to stop there and invite our first speaker, John Kiriakou, to tell us a little bit about what, for those of us who don't know very much about what firms like Stratfor do, could you tell us about who they are, what they do, what their kinds of clients are, and how this affects the quality of the intelligence that we get? Over to you, John.
Certainly. Thank you. Thanks for having me. First off, I'm very happy to talk about Stratfor because I think it's a very important issue that most people don't talk about. It's certainly an issue here in Washington. And I've always gotten a little bit of a kick out of the conversation about Stratfor because I never took Stratfor seriously as a serious organization. And frankly, I don't know any intelligence professional that did or that does. Stratfor, the joke about Stratfor for many years has been about Stratfor's so-called secret sources. They talk about what a great intelligence platform they are because they have these sources all over town. Well, the joke is that their sources are the press officers of every embassy in the city. And their other special sources are the Washington Post and the New York Times. So really what Stratfor is, what Stratfor has always been, is a group of underpaid, very attractive young women, and we can talk about that separately if you'd like, because that's who George Friedman, the co-founder of Stratfor, always hired, was very attractive young women, sitting around and reading newspapers and watching CNN and MSNBC and jotting down notes, and then calling the embassy of Yemen or the embassy of Saudi Arabia, the embassy of Jordan, and talking to the press officer there, and then writing up a report like it's some special secret insight that nobody else could possibly come to. And that's why when Jeremy Hammond, God bless him, did what he did, I was so shocked at the way the boom was lowered on him because he didn't reveal anything. He didn't reveal anything that was dangerous. What he did, though, was expose a very Washington kind of phoniness that was Stratfor and its business model. Now, what firms like Stratfor try to do, what they try to market, is a certain level of political and strategic insight that nobody else has. What they say is that they're full of former CIA people, former NSA people, former FBI people. That's just simply not true. They can't afford those people. So they hire these young college graduates, researchers, writers to just press pieces and send out their bulletins. Mostly their subscribers were individuals. Now they brag, or they used to brag on their website about how their subscribers were mostly Fortune 500 companies. That was largely not true. They were mostly individuals, LLCs, sole proprietorships with very specific questions. Should I do business in Yemen? Should I buy that silver mine in Romania? And then you would need to know things like, well, if I do want to buy that silver mine in Romania, who's going to win the next election? The conservatives who are going to let me mine the silver, or the socialists who are going to not let me mine the silver? And that's it. This was all about capitalism. It was all about making money. It wasn't about strategic thinking. It wasn't about long-term prognostication. It wasn't about secret clandestine sources. This was all about money. And that's why Stratfor didn't pay its people anything, because it was all about money for the principals and putting money into the pockets of those people who had negotiated favorable terms with the government and with other investors. So in my view, Stratfor has always just been a fake, phony, underachieving organization whose sole purpose was to make money for its initial investors. It provided nothing to the greater context of intelligence collection or intelligence analysis in Washington or even in the business community.
Thanks, John. Can I just stay with you there and ask you to tell us a little bit about how organizations like Stratfor, if they are, I heard somebody describe them as half clown, half intelligence agency. And I was really curious if they are indeed who as described, why is it that they are so powerful? Could you tell us a little bit about that, and also about your general understanding of how their information is used by organizations within the establishment, in addition to furthering the interests of capitalists?
Sure. Let me answer your second question first. The information is used by insiders to either confirm or to refute the information that the insiders have, because their sourcing is going to be different. Insiders, at the CIA, we had this mantra, and it was recruit spies to steal secrets, period. That's how you get promoted, by recruiting spies to steal secrets. Stratfor doesn't recruit spies to steal secrets. That's espionage. And they don't have diplomatic immunity or diplomatic cover to protect themselves. So they don't steal the secrets. They just read the papers and analyze the media and see if the results are the same as what the intelligence organizations are getting in their own analysis. So that's easy. It's just to either refute or to support conclusions based on different sourcing. How did they get started? Well, every retiring or former CIA officer, especially from the Directorate of Intelligence, which is the analytic organization inside the CIA, wants to keep doing what he's doing. See, at the CIA, part of the culture is to convince you that your job is so specialized that you can't do anything else, right? You can't market that skill outside the CIA. And that's one of the reasons why turnover is so low at the CIA. It's actually under 2%. And has been for decades. It's because they convince you that you can't do anything else. Where are you going to go? You're going to go to the Washington Post? You can't, because then everything that you write has to be cleared by the CIA. You'll never get anything published. So what you do, if you do leave the CIA, is you create an organization like Stratfor, or join an organization like Stratfor, which is trying to do exactly what the CIA has always been doing, but without the sourcing. So, like I say, it's an empty shell of what a real intelligence organization would do.
Thanks, John. Lauri, thank you very much for being here. Could you tell us a little bit? A lot of what we're talking about in relation to the Stratfor Leaks also has a lot to do with the work done by Anonymous. Could you tell us a little bit about the hacktivism that sits alongside these leaks, and what the people who were involved and what the circumstances that were surrounding this were about? Lauri, you're still muted. I'm just going to make sure you're unmuted.
Sorry. Yeah, I can try and fill in a little bit of those blanks. Unfortunately, the passage of time and the several assaults on my brain made it harder to remember the exact details. But yeah, the way Stratfor came into my radar as an online activist, exploring how to do activism online, the modalities of activism, and the emergence of Anonymous as this kind of network, decentralized, chaotic actor that the internet developing a conscience and trying to exert the power of the network to try and make the world a better place. It came on our radar because we found out that there was a Dirty Tricks campaign against us, and not just us, a Dirty Tricks campaign against online activists, against WikiLeaks, against Glenn Greenwald and some other journalists who were reporting on information that was coming out of online activities, and this idea that this was something that could be solved by the right kind of strategic interventions. And so Stratfor were implicated with HB Gary and Palantir and some other of these private sector intelligence adjuncts, shall we say, in attempting to disrupt these activities. Similarly to how you mentioned earlier, Deepa, the activism to do with the chemical atrocities in India, and attempts to kind of nail that activism and control it. Similar thing was being perpetrated against this new emergent tendency of online protest. And you know, as John said, these were not professionals. These are, you know, cowboys in a clown car selling Lisa Simpson's magic rock that makes the tigers go away. And, you know, you don't see any tigers here, so the rock must work. And then you can get away with this because if you claim to just have a little bit of intelligence, then maybe a few law firms or a few other firms are going to hedge their bets because they just want to, you know, potentially get that bit of intelligence before making the wrong business decision, etc., in some part of the world that they don't have full insight into. But the actual activities that were exposed were, yeah, I mean, it's to say that they were not contributing to strategic analysis or prognostication or planning is too diplomatic. They were people trying to make a quick buck by being the cyber version of the Pinkertons, you know, some adjunct to the state that can come in and throw a little muscle around and act very unprofessionally and try and ensure that things go the way that they ought to go.
Thanks, Lauri. While we're with you, could you tell us a little bit about what motivates the kinds of people who get involved in Anonymous and who are seeking to reveal such information before we go on to Suelette to talk a little bit about how that differs from whistleblowing or how that is similar to whistleblowing? So are you able to tell us a little bit about Anonymous and what kinds of people get involved, why they get involved, what motivates them, what kinds of activism they're involved in, etc.?
I mean, speaking solely through the lens of my own perspective and my own experiences, the emergence of this entity, Anonymous, or this collective dynamic of people on the internet was a liberating and empowering pivotal change in how people that were on the internet, or some small subsection of them, were able to view their ability to relate to the world. And it's not just a place that you go to escape these things that you were never really particularly on board with, but it's a means by which you can actually envision a better world and try and bring it about. And it was vastly liberating. Even small symbolic gestural token actions such as helping protesters out who are being suppressed by authoritarian regimes, or revealing information about corporate and civic malfeasance in office. It suddenly became apparent that there was a power here for a large number of people collaboratively to exercise a form of oversight, I would say, that hadn't emerged previously. And we were playing around with that role and what our ability could be to agitate for justice in that capacity.
Thanks, Lauri. I wonder if we could now move to Suelette to talk to you a little bit about what it means to hold power to account and how whistleblowers do that, and where the boundaries lie between those who are outside the organization and those who are inside the organization when they whistleblow, and also perhaps also talk a little bit about how this relates to the case of Julian Assange and the current situation in relation to how the state is going after him. So over to you, Suelette.
So it's interesting. I mean, we had this anniversary on the February 27th, 2012. WikiLeaks began publishing the global intelligence files of over 5 million emails from the Texas headquarters of this company, and the emails were from 2004 to December 2011. And this act was one of a number of acts in the activities of WikiLeaks that have really helped expand the definition of whistleblower. So traditionally, whistleblower has sort of evolved really from the 1980s and 1990s as being primarily about employees revealing serious wrongdoing, often fraud, financial fraud, from inside a company. But what we've seen is a movement over the last decade, and WikiLeaks was certainly a major causative factor in this, to broadening that definition, and that now includes, in many definitions, many protections, contractors, subcontractors. It's now been expanded to say volunteer board members of a church or a school. And so these are people who are not just employed by or subjugated, if you will, by a boss in the organization, but have some role in that community. Increasingly, I've seen debate in academic circles about whether or not university students might be considered whistleblowers by virtue of being inside a university community, even though they don't hold an official role as an employee or an oversight person like a board manager. For those people who are entirely outside of a community, and again, the lines of community blur in an electronic setting. But for those people who are entirely outside of an organization, the term that I and some other academics have used to describe people who reveal serious wrongdoing is bell ringers. And bell ringers, and particularly public interest bell ringers, which I think you would say the people who provided this information to WikiLeaks as a publisher to publish were acting in the public interest. And we can talk about what it's revealed in the public interest. Both of those sorts of people need protections. And particularly one of the things that they need protection from is a kind of ugly threat that's been emerging from the onward push towards better protection for whistleblowers. And so that better protection has been exemplified by a huge growth over the last decades in the number of laws and implementations of policy that protect whistleblowers, including by the end of 2021, some 27 countries in the European Union who will all have to adopt a minimum standard set of laws in national transposition of the EU directive protecting whistleblowers. This is a massive thing. It's fantastic. So why is this important? Well, you've seen this move, but there are threats to this move. And one of the threats to it is a risk that whistleblowers, and we've seen this in Julian Assange's case and in other cases, will be charged with data misuse or unauthorized access of data charges, and that this will be the side door channel that is used to attack the whistleblower or someone who reveals makes a disclosure in the public interest. Well, why is that? Okay, it's because most things are actually stored in electronic form these days, and we aren't reverting to paper very much, and so a lot of the computer misuse acts internationally have a very broad scope. And they basically refer to either using any telecommunications, facility. Well, we all use those every day. They follow us around like tracking devices with our phones, or any online technology or any data that's stored in a technological basis. So that's a pretty serious concern. That's a threat to the whistleblower and the kind of general movement that happened from 2010 to now. And that is a push towards more transparency. So I think one thing that's really important about the role of public interest bell ringers as well as whistleblowers, and this is an emerging thing that has happened really over the last decade to 15 years, is that we once in our free and open democracies believed that transparency was a corrective mechanism in its own right. So you have FOI laws, for example, and freedom of the press. And that's great. But we're drowning in data, right? We have more data. I can't even keep all the files straight on my computer, you know, let alone all the other data that's on the internet. We are drowning in data, which is probably why some people pay a lot of money to places like Stratfor. The problem with that is that what's in short supply now is less the data and more the guides and the signposts. And the guides and the signposts are incredibly important. Those that do so in the public interest are doubly so. And so punishing the whistleblower or punishing the public interest bell ringer is taking away that kind of key junction in the process that you need to have a protective umbrella over in the public interest. And that process looks like the whistleblower, the public interest bell ringer, to, for example, the journalist, to the publisher, to the public. If you break down any element of that chain, the people who lose are the public. And we've seen, you know, for example, significant whistleblowing case, Alton Deltour's case, the LuxLeak case. You know, he was initially charged with he was going to be charged with a computer crimes related charge, and this is not unusual at all. So I think that's where we've got a kind of nexus point that's very relevant to this case. I might just add that, in terms of some big headline observations about why this case is so important, I mean, the clowns comment is quite funny. You could make an observation that Stratfor, we thought that they were all connected to the CIA, as John said, but really they were sitting at their desk doing Google searches all day long. And as John, and it's not only a question the CIA has access to information that obviously they don't have, but CIA actually does operations. They don't just do Google searches, right? So and that's really, I mean, you could say that's the difference as well between, I don't know, Blackwater and The Economist. So I think The Atlantic might have quoted someone at the time that the Stratfor documents were published, saying something like, what you got in the intelligence reports from Stratfor is what you could have gotten from The Economist the week before. And I think, the observation that Stratfor has paid sources, which came out of this, is interesting, because I believe the Atlantic also said, yes, we have people like that. They're called reporters. But the difference is their reports go to the public. So those are kind of my observations on this.
Thank you, Suelette. Thank you very much. I'd just like to move very briefly, if I may, to introduce Professor Ian Munro, who is one of the co-founders of Free the Truth, and to ask if, Ian, would you like to add to this discussion of whistleblowing, because you are a highly regarded whistleblowing expert, and I wondered whether you wanted to add to the comments Suelette has just made before we go to questions, just to warn everybody who's watching in the audience, if you wouldn't mind posting your questions. If you're on the Zoom, if you can post it within the Q&A tab, then I can pick it up for the speakers. And if you're watching on one of the other channels, our tech experts who are beavering on behind the scenes will post them back to me. So hopefully we will capture many of the questions that you want to ask. So if you can please post your questions now while Ian is speaking, then we can try and pass them out to the right speakers. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Deepa, and thanks very much for the speakers and their very valuable insights into the Stratfor Leaks, and more generally into the role of these private security, in inverted commas, or private intelligence firms, regardless of their competence. And of course, if you read the global intelligence files, or some of them, they're riven with prejudice, mistakes, and of course, basic errors, all coming probably from the newspapers that they're reading, I suspect, rather than intelligence work, as has been pointed out already. And I completely agree with what Suelette just said. If you think of the whistleblower Chelsea Manning, she was charged with a whole bunch of things, but she was actually only convicted of computer fraud and misuse. I think it was 3 counts, 5 counts, and put in prison for 35 years. And that what they do, what the judge did in that case, was, of course, give the maximum possible sentence for a relatively mundane, apparently mundane crime, because they couldn't convict her of anything else, because she'd done the public interest disclosure. She'd revealed the existence of war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq. And Julian Assange, of course, is being prosecuted for more or less the same thing, based on similar laws, except he's being, even though he wasn't the whistleblower, he was the journalist who handled the disclosures, Chelsea Manning's disclosures. He's up for 175 years. And of course, it's, as many people have already pointed out, this is criminalization, or not only of whistleblowing, but we, on the one hand, we've got these new whistleblower laws being created for whistleblower protection, which is all great. But on the other hand, we've got other laws being used or misused for very severely to try and deter whistleblowers, and also whistleblower journalists and people who support whistleblowers. But yeah, I think it's a very serious problem, not just amongst the whistleblowing the community, but also in the activist community more generally. I think last year or the year before last, Amnesty International produced a major report on the role of private intelligence firms that were tracking activists, and I think they particularly focused on a firm called the NSO. But this is obviously a growing problem, and I remember, as well as WikiLeaks, I remember Mr. Robert Thibault raising the issue that activists were being tracked by the intelligence community as well, journalists and so on. He gave the example of a police whistleblower in Canada, and the journalist was asked by the Canadian police force to, can you get information on the journalist so that we can find out who the whistleblower is. But yeah, I think that this is a serious problem. I just want to, even though the company, as it were, Stratfor, may be clownish and not particularly professional, or if you look at UC Global, of course, that seems to have had much more of an effect, as it were, in the sense that it seems to have had more very close links with US intelligence, and also with the type of information, surveying lawyers, journalists, whistleblowers, anyone talking to WikiLeaks staff, and also possibly providing information or misinformation, which is then being circulated in within the media. But I was just wondering what, I would like to ask a question of the speakers. What do you do about it? How do you, of course, in the H.B. Gary case, Anonymous basically revealed how incompetent H.B. Gary was, and that this led to a decline in its reputation and its insolvency. But how do we deal with this? How do we address this issue? Does any of the speakers have any particular?
I could jump in at this point. I think we actually ought to take seriously Mike Pompeo's suggestion of what the world needs, and that is a public intelligence agency that is not beholden to the partisan interess of a particular region or a particular corporation or a particular demographic, but is beholden to the interests of humanity at large. And the reason we need to have a public distributed decentralized intelligence agency is because, as Suelette said, our grievous, our responsibility, our duty to act as the overseers of power, which is of inestimable importance for a civic society. It's the reason we have a court in public. It's the reason why the king deliberates at the court in public. It's the reason why the administration of law is done in public. It's the reason why democracy is done transparently and publicly as far as possible. And that's because power, when it is not under oversight that is effective, tends inevitably towards corruption, and unpleasant things happen. And the problem is it's not a lack of information that we have, it's a lack of ability to analyze that information and understand the import. And so we need to bootstrap the structures so that the public can continue to see what is being done with the power that is ceded we must remember this, that all power is ceded by the public to governments and to private corporate entities, etc., to ensure that they are not crossing some lines in the sand that we should, retain the right to draw. And I think we've lost that. And as we transfer into this digital age, we have to think to ourselves very carefully, how do we continue to have that faculty to exercise that oversight? And for that, we need entities like WikiLeaks. But it's not just the ability to source documents, to offer source protections and to publish them without fear or favor, but it's also meaningful analysis and implications. And so this speaks to the way that whistleblowing and bell ringing, in Suelette's fantastic extension of that analogy, become now an integral part of the role of journalism in society, that it's inextricable. It's no longer just this separate class of journalists whose job it is to report on the news, but anyone in any position where they interact with a system where some information about the inner workings of that system is necessary to be known by the greater whole, now puts on the hat of that duty to disclose. And we need to make it as frictionless. We need to eliminate all the barriers of entry to do that. We need to make it safe, and we need to make it effective, because without that, power will continue to tend towards tyranny.
Thanks, Lauri. There are a couple of questions which are surfacing in the chat, and before we go into that, one of the things that it's worth probably picking up is a question about Julian and the way, Lauri talked about holding power to account, and how a democracy works and how it should be transparent, and how we should understand that the justice system works in a reasonable way. And I'd like to go to Suelette and Lauri to talk to them a little bit about. Suelette, could you tell us about how this timeline of the Stratfor Leaks sits with the broader timeline of Julian's indictments, and particularly could you focus on the way the superseding indictments were introduced, and explain that a little bit to us, because I think a lot of people don't understand the problems with due process, not just in terms of companies like Stratfor planning to hold Julian as one of as some of the leaks revealed, keep him as a bride in prison, move him from country to country. So to talk about these things, but then also perhaps go to Lauri and talk about a little bit about what the extradition process feels like. So, because although this webinar is essentially commemorating the Stratfor Leaks, I think we have to also talk about the organization and the people who were involved in bringing the information that was of public interest to light, and how much many of them have lost and have sacrificed in order for us to be able to know what's really going on. Whereas the people who are the war criminals, the Bushes, the Blairs, the Obamas of this world, are putting out new books and sitting free and enjoying their lives. So I think we do have to talk about what's happening in Julian's case, and what's happening in Belmarsh prison, where Julian, he's been given his warm clothes in October, or rather they've been sent into him, and yet the prison hasn't delivered them to him, and he's been sitting freezing cold, preparing for the trial of his life. And this really brings a sense of urgency to our discussion. So over to you, Suelette, if you can tell us a little bit about the second superseding indictment and the broader timeline, and then we'll go to Lauri about the extradition process.
Yeah, I mean, so, Julian is dragged out of the embassy. There are initial charges laid against him in April 2019. And this has been due to a change of government in Ecuador, and the US actively lobbying Ecuador and being instrumental in raising billions of dollars of loans to Ecuador, with, I think, one of the price tags being Julian Assange. So in late May 2019, the Espionage Act charges are unveiled against Julian, and normally when those charges are unveiled. That's the last word. And that's because the UK, as the kind of men in the middle of all this, has to go through a set of processes to start this proceeding, because he's not being tried for these crimes in the UK. He's being, the debate is one of extradition, not whether or not he's guilty of those particular crimes at this time. So the hearing opens itself in February 2020. And that's because the US is pushing to speed things up. They want things to happen quickly. And there are a set of hearings that are held. And then in June 2020, June 24, all of a sudden the US is like, well, actually, we've got additional charges that we want laid. And the charge sheet is superseding, hence the name superseding indictment, the previous charges. So it replaces the previous indictment. Now, this is so confusing to the process and probably unprecedented in the UK extradition proceedings that have gone before for anyone. Certainly in my knowledge, I don't know of any case where this has been done sort of halfway through when the cake is half baked, that the UK is floundering around for 4 to 6 weeks after this has happened, because they don't know what to do with it. They're not sure how to process it. It's actually a very outrageous thing for the US DOJ to have done at that time. And at the time, these superseding indictment, this list of new charges, are just kind of plonked on the website of the DOJ. No articles, no fanfare, just one day it kind of appears. Who knows, possibly that was how the UK government learned about it. We don't know. But, from then September, there is the hearing, and Julian Assange is, formally readdressed and, on these new charges. Now, you just wouldn't normally do that. It's not normal behavior. And he's now not having the opportunity to respond properly to a set of these new charges, which is completely outrageous in the justice system where he's about to be extradited. So not having the opportunity to challenge these new allegations is really an abuse of process. But that's what has gone on here. It's possible that the judge took a very dim view of this. In a sense, it's an insult to the British justice system. I don't think you could describe it as anything else. It treats the British justice system with a kind of contempt. And I suspect that most British judges would take a dim view of that. So that's where, that's where his case is at the moment. Obviously, the Biden administration has decided to appeal the finding of the lower court, which had what many people in civil society would argue is a very bad set of decisions for freedom of the press and freedom of expression and human rights, right up until the point in the decision where the judge rules not to extradite him, but really on the grounds of his mental health. So, I'm not saying he's not bad, but he's mad, and therefore we won't extradite him. It's kind of smeared, but at least he's not extradited. But the U.S. didn't have to actually fight those. They could have just said, it's going to be a hard fight on legal grounds, and therefore it's a waste of taxpayers' monies. And by the way, we have a whole new administration. Do we really want to spend the next years chasing the ghosts of the last 4 years administration? And so they could have just decided to not proceed with that. Instead, they have decided to do so. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I think one of the important things that has come out of Julian's case, but it's also come out of the other cases related to it. For example, Jeremy Hammond's case, Chelsea Manning's case, is the biggest kind of existential threat to the nature of investigative journalism that we've seen in a long time. And that threat looks like this: where you have a journalist who finds information, a tip-off that there is serious wrongdoing that is happening. It may be illegal, it may be just immoral, it may offend the public mores. And they ask for the disclosure of that information, whether it's a public interest bell ringer or a whistleblower, for some evidence in support of that allegation. There is a tilt in the kinds of charges that have been laid against the people involved in this, decade-long saga. And that tilt is to ask for that evidence is becoming a criminalized act. It is criminalizing the act of verification. And it's very ironic because many politicians around the world stand on their soapbox and say, oh my God, it's terrible. Facebook publishes fake news. It's awful, awful, awful. But here you actually have something that will undermine the verification of the accuracy of news in reporting. But it creates a terrible precedent. It's bad for the whistleblower and integrity in society and the organization, and it's bad for journalism. And the last thing you want to have is journalists who don't ask for evidence, because then they're going to print things that are simply wrong.
I think we saw some of that when either because of journalists who choose not to ask for evidence, or journalists who view the evidence only through a particular lens when they are, for example, embedded journalists doing war journalism, and like the journalist who was a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who was unwilling to reveal what happened within the collateral murder video until WikiLeaks revealed it and Chelsea's testimony came through, and it became more and more evident that he knew about this information. So yes, it is really worrying, isn't it, to see how evidence gathering and the process by which we can penetrate some of the complexity and the opacity of these kinds of very complex institutions, which make very important decisions about our lives, and yet we have very little control over, and where individuals in these institutions are hiding behind these facades to essentially enrich themselves, whether it is shareholders of Stratfor or whether it is the owners of organizations such as these who are hiring intelligence people who are sitting within the establishment who then come over and make money for themselves. But just to take a step back before we go into perhaps with you a little bit, John, in a second, about how companies like Stratfor smear people and what kinds of information the leaks actually revealed. Could I come back to Lauri? And what I wanted to talk about this idea of holding power to account. And we saw on the screen flashing by, for those of you who were watching the live stream, the information provided by Declassified UK, which showed that there are serious questions about conflicts of interest in relation to Lady Emma Arbuthnot, who was the chief magistrate at Westminster Magistrates Court, and how her son is involved with a company called Dark Trace, which seeks to shut down places like WikiLeaks. How her husband is partnering with Sir Richard Dearlove in relation to things, and how she herself receives financial benefits from secretive partner organizations of the UK Foreign Office. And looking at that, and looking at, for example, a judge at a hearing where Julian is called in front of the court, he says his name and his date of birth, and the judge brands him a narcissist. What does it feel like to go through this extradition process, particularly if you are somebody perhaps on the autism spectrum who is expecting certainty? My understanding from the work of Professor Niels Meltzer, the UN Special Rapporteur, who has confirmed that Julian was being exposed to psychological torture, is that a big part of psychological torture is the arbitrariness of the process, and also the inability to rely on institutions that are supposed to protect you. For example, in Julian's case, he sought asylum, he was granted asylum, and then without grounds, his citizenship was revoked, and without due process. Similarly, when he goes to the court, everybody else gets treated a certain way, he gets treated differently. In fact, the law has to be changed after the case is taken in Julian's case in order to make the European extradition warrants, for example, run in an appropriate way, or whether it is in relation to the treatment as Westminster Magistrates Court. And I say this as somebody who was a legal observer at Julian's hearings, and how difficult it was to attend those hearings, and how we were intentionally kept out of the process, so that the right of the public to know, as much as it is a right of Julian to have an extradition hearing or a judicial process where the public can understand what's going on in his case, was totally trampled over in this case. So I'd like to move back to Lauri, please, and talk to you a little bit about your experience of the extradition process and what it feels like in terms of this arbitrariness within the process, please. Over to you, Lauri.
Thank you, Deepa. Yeah, I mean, if you haven't had the wonderful opportunity in your lives yet to read Franz Kafka, I suggest you do. He wrote a book called The Trial, and from that and some of his other writings, we have this adjective in the English language, Kafkaesque. And Kafkaesque basically means, well, how can you describe it? It's a system of administration of so-called justice or law that is arbitrary, that is undermining, that is to some extent gaslighting the people that are involved in it, because of all the expectations that things should proceed a certain way, that there should be a sort of bare fairness, a bare equality to it. You see these evaporate as you participate in the system, and it can be small things such as when you're put into Westminster Magistrates Court, you're not able to sit with counsel, you're not able to confer with counsel and help them represent you, as is their brief, as is their responsibility, and as is your right to inform them. You're put in a little goldfish bowl, effectively segregated from the rest of the court and presented to the court as a guilty party. And Suelette reminded us that trial is not to establish guilt. The judges in an extradition hearing should not allow themselves to form an opinion on the guilt of or non-guilt of the requested person. However, we see that it colors their decision-making the way that the United States, in particular, because of our unbalanced extradition treaty with the US, is able to completely set the stage and frame the narrative and steal a march on the storytelling by the way the allegations are put together in the indictments that form the extradition request. And then, as Suelette said, they can somehow late in the game just decide to wipe that slate and put a whole bunch of new things on there. And the problem in an extradition hearing is you don't have a right to contest any of these claims. I'll say that again for the people at the back. You are sitting in a goldfish bowl in the dock being lied about by the most powerful organization in the world, the most powerful entity in the world, indirectly, the sole remaining superpower in the world, in front of a institution that in theory administers justice under truth, that ensures the outcome by ensuring truth, to ensure that justice is done. You sit and you listen to people lie about you, and you can't even raise your hand and say, please, miss, please, lady, not to impugn any of our judiciary in particular, but please can these people I haven't met from another country I've never been to stop lying about me so that they can lock me up in a small box for the rest of my life, because that isn't the way I was raised to believe courts should work. There should be an adversarial process of contesting evidence and an impartial panel of people who are not part of the establishment, the same political entity that is embroiled in the abuses of power that you are bringing to light. And there should be that, at least that check and balance. And all of these things are not there in the extradition process. So it is a little bit like you're being served a meal of justice, but there's no nutrients in there. There's just psychological torture, and it's not a pleasant process to be put through. And this is why it's so essential to have have other people involved, not to exempt themselves as passive observers, but to actually participate, as you attempted to do, Deepa, as a legal observer in this process, and so many other fantastic organizations around the world have attempted to do, to say, hold on a minute, you can't get away with this. Like we are here to watch and ensure that what's done is right. And every effort has been made in Julian's case to obstruct that oversight faculty again, to ensure that things can be done in a twisted and underhanded way. And it's not very pleasant for anyone, and I can only speak from my own experience, but someone of my, shall we say, personality typology, or someone who's in the kind of mold of mindset of viewing the world that I have a very strong sense of innate justice and what is right, and then to be put into that, what should be a sacred and hallowed place for the administration of that justice, and to see its integrity and its honor besmirched by the way that process is not put together and orchestrated to ensure justice, but put together and orchestrated to assure a particular outcome, a political outcome. And that political outcome in this case is the suppression of the vital and necessary duty of journalists to report the truth without fear and favor. We say without fear and favor. And you cannot say that anyone who is aspiring to be an investigative journalist or is working at a publication in the capacity of an editor is not looking at this case and thinking, well, I know where the line is now. I know how far I can go and not any further before I come under the crosshairs. And I have myself detained in various forms extra legally for a decade, subjected to a vile character assassination campaign, my life made into a sordid soap opera mockery, and facing withering away in a cell for daring to give the public what the public needs to know about things like war crimes, things like abuses of power in detention in Guantanamo, all of the things that we absolutely must be able to see so that we can say no, so that we can say this is not on. So yeah, I guess to summarize, the extradition process is very, very, very flawed. It is a simulacra, it is a simulation of justice in the sense of Baudrillard. It puts on all of the airs, it puts on all of the costumes, and it goes through the motions. But when you're sitting there, you can see that it is not bent towards the moral arc of this process is not bent towards justice as it should be. That's harrowing. And I'm lucky being the first person for whom extradition to the United States was refused on the grounds of the foreign bar, and that it would be unjust and oppressive to put someone with any sort of mental, physical health complications into such a barbaric system of detention. I was lucky to be able to be here and speak to you about this. But these situations haven't changed. The detention system is still barbaric. Someone put in there with any psychological difficulties will not flourish. They will expect to have degradation of their physical and mental condition, and an inability to provide meaningful care to them. And so we're still fighting that battle in Julian's case. And I just want to implore everyone to remember that it's like we're all in this fight. We can all play a role. We can all do something, even if it's just letting the power know that you are observing. So writing a letter, turning up at court, expressing an opinion, sharing this, discussing it with friends and family, and say, well, this does concern me. It does concern me. I want to live in a world where an organization and a person takes great risk and exercises great courage to help the world see what is being done in their name, with the power that they cede, with the money that they give to the state. I want to live in a world where that person is not crushed mercilessly to set an example to others that power should not be held to account.
It's so powerful, Lauri. And having spoken to you a couple of times, I just moved by what you have sacrificed and how deep your sense of justice is and what contribution you have made to the world in being able to do this, and how much you've been put through, which is completely and so utterly wrong and unjust. Carrying on with this sense of barbarism that you spoke about, Julian, if he is extradited to the United States, will face 175 years in a maximum security prison. For those of you who don't know what it feels like to be in the Alexandria Detention Center, there is a clip available online, which we will try and share through the chat, of what it feels like inside the prison. But essentially, even at pre-trial stage, this is before any guilt has been established, Julian will be kept in a very small cell. And the US specializes in these really strange terms. For example, Julian will be kept under special administrative measures, which for anybody who's read the Center for Constitutional Rights report on what they call the darkest corner of the world, special administrative measures are essentially ways in which you are cut off and your lawyers are cut off from speaking to the rest of the world in relation to your trial. You are also placed in administrative segregation, as they term it, which is essentially solitary confinement, where you're in your cell 22 hours a day, which the UN has clearly defined as a form of torture. And as Chelsea, of course, went through this. In fact, she was placed in a cage and at times was deprived of her clothing. And the horrendousness of the process doesn't end there. They also talk about, one of the things that really bothered me when I was listening to the hearings was the way in which, firstly, the prosecution, the CPS, talked about mental health, and the way in which it was described. And most of this process has been around, described around Julian and his personality, rather than in relation to the way in which states are stamping on citizens. But in relation to Julian, they talked about, even the judge talked about his mental health. But actually, this is not a case of mental health, but a case of mental injury caused by 5 states stamping on his head collectively and repeatedly over a period of a decade. Mm-hmm. And it's also about how in Julian's case, the way in which in that court, the United States was trying to pretend as though the US prison system is going to be a holiday where Julian will have career development courses in relation to what he could potentially, he would have access to this particular TV channel, which would train him to think about what he could do once he was released from prison, or how to improve his personal skills, which, of course, no criticism of prison education, but this was, in fact, it was worse than any re-education camp you can imagine in some of the worst dictatorships. And I know, John, in terms of your sacrifice, you have been through the US prison system yourself and experienced its brutality, as has Mumia Abu Jamal, whom we heard from last week on the Assange defense webinar, but also as have the Guantanamo prisoners, many of whom have died in Guantanamo without charge and never getting due process, including children who were, arrested when they were 14 and then committed suicide when they were 21 while still inside Guantanamo. So the US prison system isn't known for its excessive kindness or its superiority. In fact, the rate of suicides in the prison population, and particularly those under these extreme solitary confinement measures, is extremely high compared to but what else can you do if you're faced with 175 years, where at least at the CPS seem to keep suggesting they would do everything to keep him alive so they can make sure he goes through the 100 years, whatever is left of his life. So could I move to you, John, after getting off that soapbox about how unjust this is? And could you tell us a little bit?
Where do I even begin? There are so many things that are desperately wrong with the US prison system. First of all, everything that you said about solitary confinement is true. The New York Times did an expose in the spring of 2016 on one of the maximum security prisons in the state of California. And they talked about how the United Nations has determined that solitary confinement for any length of time beyond 15 days is a form of torture. Well, in the United States, we keep prisoners in solitary confinement for as long as 44 years. Now imagine 44 years with no human contact. This New York Times expose in California was talking about a solitary confinement system where you literally have no contact with any other human being. When you receive mail, for example, you don't actually get the mail. There's a computer monitor hanging from the ceiling of your cell, of your 6 foot by 10 foot cell, out of reach so you can't damage it in any way. They'll put your correspondence on the screen for 5 minutes. You stand there and read it, and then it's taken off. And that's it. The only visitors you're allowed to have are your attorneys, and even they are restricted to once a month. You're allowed 1 phone call a month. It's monitored, of course, live. You're allowed 2 showers a week. Your meals are provided to you through a slot in the door. And you know, when we talk about lockdown for 23 hours a day and exercise for 1 hour a day, it's not really exercise in the conventional definition of the term. Every one of these cells, and I know this because I was in solitary confinement, but every one of these cells has a small door at the back, and that door leads to a cage that's outside. Now the cage in my case was another 6 by 10 feet. And so you can either walk around in a circle or in an oval in your indoor 6 by 10 cell, or 1 hour a day, go outside into the cage and walk in a 6 by 10 foot circle. That's enough to drive the sanest man insane. At this California prison, things got so desperate that prisoners were smashing windows and eating the broken glass just so they could go outside for medical care and speak to another human being. That's what these special administrative measures are. Now, there are SAM units within prisons, and then there's a SAM unit that is a prison. That's at the U.S. Penitentiary at Terre Haute, Indiana, where the whistleblower Marty Gottesfeld is currently being held. Presumably, if Julian were to be extradited, and I think he will not be, he would go to the SAM unit at Terre Haute, Indiana. The thing with SAM units, especially at Terre Haute, is the focus is to keep the prisoner away from the media. It's all about communication. You know, I was in this modified SAM unit at the U.S. prison in Loretto, Pennsylvania, and I was not permitted to file a Freedom of Information Act request about myself. That was a part of my plea agreement, that I could never file a FOIA request ever again in my life. And I thought to myself one day, you know, these people are so stupid, just by their nature. They're just stupid people, because who else would work in a prison than a dum-dum? That I decided to file a FOIA request anyway, just to see if they would catch it. And they didn't catch it. And they actually responded to it quite quickly. Most of what they sent me was stupid stuff, my own medical records, my own visitors list, things like that. But there were about a dozen pages that were very interesting and very important. They were internal memos about how to deal with me. And there was one that was very simple and very important. And it was 1 page, and it was written in very large block letters. And it was from the warden to all personnel in the prison. And it said, "Caution, inmate has access to the media." And that's really what the nature of this problem for them was, that I had access to the media. Well, Julian is the media. And so imagine the lengths that they'll go to silence Julian. Now, in my silly little position, all I had to do was to smuggle I wrote a blog regularly called Letters from Loretto that I turned into a book when I got home. But I would just simply smuggle it out with other prisoners, or I would smuggle it out through one of my attorneys, the whistleblower attorney, Jesselyn Radak. And it was easy enough. Marty Gottesfeld can't get anything out of that prison. And certainly if Julian were in the U.S. penitentiary at Terre Haute, they would be on him like white on rice, as we say here in the States. He wouldn't be able to communicate with anybody. But that's the point. The point isn't just to punish him. The point is to punish him and to silence him. Because when you silence him, he can't get that message out. And so people like us remain uninformed. We don't know what's going on. We can't push that message of truth and transparency and openness because we just don't have access to it. That's the point. Now, we're lucky in the respect, and Julian is lucky in the respect that that the Justice Department is going to have to legally justify its own prison system, and it's unjustifiable. And so I think that's where the victory is for Julian. I think the U.S. put itself in a corner that it can't get out of, where they would have to convince the Court of Appeals and perhaps the Supreme Court and perhaps the European Court of Justice that no, there's nothing wrong with the U.S. prison system. Not only will Julian get a fair hearing in the United States, they'll argue, but when he's convicted, and he will be convicted because, you know, the justice system isn't just in the U.S., they'll lock him up in a SAM unit. So for Julian, in the event that he's not able to protect himself, and again, I think that he will be, the fix is in. There's no justice here.
Yep. Thanks, John. One of the things that was visible through the hearings was the fact that Julian had been moved to the medical unit at Belmarsh, not because they were concerned seriously about his medical health, although his medical condition was serious in itself. They put him there to keep him out of reach of the kinds of cameras that were revealing for prisoners who had taken footage of him, which got revealed on YouTube within Belmarsh. So talking about segregating people in order to not let them access the media is not something that appears now to be unusual in British prisons either. Could I now take, I'm trying to draw in a couple of questions at a time from the audience, but one of the questions that I think needs a standalone answer is, could you give us some quotes from the different Stratfor Leaks? And I'm hoping that Suelette might be able to share some of this with us.
Well, yeah, I mean,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
The emails do provide some insight into the psyche of the people in these privatized pseudo intelligence providing firms. So one of the messages reads, Assange is going to make a nice bride in prison. Screw the terrorist. He'll be eating cat food forever unless George Soros hires him. Interestingly, there's information in some of the other ones that's quite telling. So one of them is reporting on him being arrested and due to appear in a court in Westminster soon to face charges of rape, accused by 2 women in Sweden. Quote, charges of sexual assault rarely are passed through Interpol red notices like this one. So this is no doubt about trying to disrupt WikiLeaks' release of government documents. And then they talk about, you know, whether it could disrupt the long-term viability of WikiLeaks. Then there's a sort of long discussion between a set of people about whether or not the deaths in Iraq are comparable to Pearl Harbor. And they're actually putting counts in the email. Well, there were, you know, Pearl Harbor had 2,400, you know, and 2 military killed and 57 civilians killed, whereas, you know, in the U.S. fatalities in Iraq were 4,429 and 179 UK fatalities. And the argument that goes back and forth in this email is, but it took, and I'm quoting, so excuse my French, but it took years of fucking up to get to that point in Iraq. Pearl wasn't even a single day, it was a single morning. And so the mentality here is, it seems very at odds with what the public would think was, acceptable about justifying, trying to stop a war. It's like, well, it took longer to kill all these civilians and people in Iraq, and therefore it's not okay to actually report on it. Another amusing entry was a comment really on how they view, I guess, their clients in Washington. The foggy bottom bow ties have their panties in a knot over a specific Iraq cable outed yesterday. Not sure which one may be yanked. So that's a clearly not very complimentary perspective they have on the people who pay their bills. Did you have a couple of ones you wanted to mention, John? Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in and cut you off.
No, actually, I was going to talk about some of the same things. It seems to me that these little embarrassing snippets of information that were released were not as embarrassing to them as the fact that they lost all their customers' credit card numbers, and they had to go back and apologize to everybody. And they were embarrassed, and they were humiliated, and they wanted to take it out on Jeremy Hammond. So I
should add to that
please do.
One of the companies whose credit card numbers was leaked was the law firm of the judge's husband, the judge who presided over Jeremy Hammond's criminal conviction. So in any barely functioning world, she would have had to recuse herself, and it kind of just speaks to the fact that it's this incestuous relationship between these entities and the people that are supposed to be keeping an eye on them.
Thanks, Lauri. Could I just move back to something we talked about with Suelette, which is the normalization of war that comes from the use of intelligence agencies such as this, and what WikiLeaks did to kind of bash through that barrier and remind us about, we talk about Black Lives Matter, but actually when people have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, that doesn't seem to count. So I wondered, Ian, if you would like to comment on some of the normalization of war and how whistleblowing and WikiLeaks helps to surface that, please.
Thanks, Deepa. Yeah, I think a really important aspect of this particular case, if you look at the Stratfor Leaks, some of its clients, of course, are big companies, but a lot of them are actually military companies, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and so on. And a lot of these, if you think of not just the military budget, but the intelligence budget, a lot of it is outsourced to private contractors. Edward Snowden, for example, was working for a private contractor when he blew the whistle on global mass surveillance and so on. And WikiLeaks itself, as Lauri has highlighted, it's an intelligence agency for the public. It's a public interest, as it were, intelligence agency. And that many of the whistleblowers who were going to visit WikiLeaks were in fact members of the former UK and US intelligence community who had blown the whistle on corrupt actions that they had witnessed, such as Mr. Kiriakou, bravely come out and spoke about this, and then got interested in the work of WikiLeaks subsequently. And I remember an event a few years ago at which John Kiriakou and Robert Thibault and Craig Murray, all very courageous whistleblowers and so on, they talked about their own circumstances, but they made a very big an important message to the audience that the work of WikiLeaks was vital, even though their cases were not necessarily directly linked at that time. And I hadn't really made that link at that time. Just it is a historic case because, as has been mentioned before, it's related to the criminalized, if this happens, if this goes through, Julian Assange gets prosecuted, then this is the end of journalism. Because this is a journalist that was actually doing what all the other newspapers weren't doing. And in 2001, I think there has been a massive sea change in global politics, and it's associated with the war on terror. And essentially, it's the normalization of war. I would describe it as you just said, and that means that if you look at The Guardian, for example, which generally does very good articles about things like climate change, gender discrimination, and all sorts of good stuff. But if you look at it, it's published so many. It's given a lot of time to Tony Blair. I think 75 articles, either interviews or basically press releases. Since this guy was responsible for this whole way in which a very strange man, President George W. Bush, decided to go and bomb a country unrelated to 9/11 in response to 9/11. And since then, there's been a whole bunch of other racist wars of aggression against other countries, and very few journalists are challenging this. But WikiLeaks challenges this. Not only that, it through the work of whistleblowers, insiders who know what's going on, it reveals the dynamics which other journalists, for whatever reason, aren't doing. And I think it's crucial. This work is so vital, not just for investigative journalism generally, but also for this dreadful turn from 2001 onwards. This sort of increased militarization of the internet, this general normalization of war in the media, and people who call out, are concerned about anti-war activists and human rights activists. They get tracked by these companies, they get smeared by these private intelligence organizations, they get tracked, surveyed by them, and there's an attempt to discredit them. And again, Julian Assange has become this center, the absolute sort of epicenter of this struggle. And I think, this really is of historic importance, basically, this case.
Thanks, Ian. Could I just move back to you, John, to ask, before I come round to all the speakers for closing comments, to ask a question which has come from the audience, which is not actually a question, it's a comment. And the writer sends greetings from the Peace and Neutrality Alliance in Ireland, and says that they, as a civil servant, as a retired civil servant, they don't share the general view about whistleblowers. And they have known cases where whistleblowers made mistakes. This particular individual knew the mistaker and the mistakee, as he refers to him. The reason he supports Julian Assange is because he exposed criminal behavior by the US government. And he says that does require exposure. But, and this is the controversial bit, at least for me, is that in general, I have reservations about whistleblowing. And I'd like to bring in John, Suelette, and Ian about that, if I may. And if you could comment on that, John.
On the day that I met Jesselyn Radak, it was about 4 days after my arrest. I had read some quotes that Jesselyn had given to the Washington Post, and I had never met her, and I wanted to thank her for supporting me in public. So I called her at something like 6 o'clock in the morning. I thought I would just leave a message, and she answered her phone. And I introduced myself, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry that you've been arrested. Why don't you come to my office and let's meet?" So I went to her office a few hours later. I was there for 2 hours, and she agreed to take my case and to help me. And on the way out, I said to her, "I want to thank you so much because I know that you only represent whistleblowers, and I'm not a whistleblower." And she said, "But you are a whistleblower." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just a regular guy who just happened to see something that I objected to. And I said something publicly." And she said, "No whistleblower thinks he's a whistleblower, but there's a legal definition of whistleblowing, and that is bringing to light any evidence of waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety." And she said, "That's what you did. You're the poster boy for whistleblowing." Well, that was a revelation to me. And one of the other things that I learned in this whole process is that oftentimes, well, most of the time, whistleblowing is not really a clean process. Sometimes the whistleblower is really not a compelling figure. It's somebody who's hard to like, but that shouldn't matter. All that should matter is the information that is revealed. One of the other things that I learned is motivation for whistleblowing is irrelevant. All that's relevant is the information. Does the information meet those requirements of exposing waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, or threats to the public health or public safety? Once I understood that and accepted that, it was far easier for me to appreciate what it was that so many different whistleblowers around the world were coming forward with. You don't have to like the whistleblower. You don't even have to agree with the whistleblower. You just have to respect the information.
Thanks, John. Suelette, Ian, did you want to come in on that, or should we move to final comments?
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Ian, would you like to go first?
After you, Suelette, please.
I think I might just sort of jump to some final comments, if I might, and it's a little bit upbeat in this sense. So one of the Stratfor males in the publication wrote, certainly the DOJ have a poster case for a range of criminal indictments to include the death penalty for Assange. Manning will be deep fried. I think one of the other things that comes out in these emails is Stratfor saying, we could maybe take the man down, but it may not be possible to kill off this thing he's created, this WikiLeaks thing that he's created. And by that, they meant not just the organization, but a way of thinking, a new way of thinking and a new set of actions. And I think that in a positive sense, their fear was well-founded. And that's because although Julian has spent more than 7 years in one form or another in either prisons or not having his freedom and under deep constraint, in that time, we've seen things like Italian journalist Stefania Marazzi running a court case around WikiLeaks related information that was being sought through FOI. The Met had been blocking just as a tactic, and took the matter to an upper court on appeal and won, overturning a lower court's bad decision. And that resulted in an important finding for all journalists' access to information. We've seen more than 100 secure drop boxes rolled out around the world, not just in support of anti-war movements or general reporting about corruption, but protecting environmental crimes, protecting COVID related, not crimes, but fighting environmental crimes, fighting COVID supply chain and other crimes, immediate threat to safety, political corruption, all sorts of areas, both specialty in field, specialty in geography. That is now such a mainstream idea that it's de rigueur in most major reputable media organizations. That was Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. They invented that. Dozens of countries around the world have in the last decade adopted whistleblower protection laws, and thousands of organizations have done so, often required by law, including first laws that applied federally here in Australia in 2012-13, and then most recently in the last 2 years, laws that applied to the private sector. And then we'll see these 27 countries rolled out by the end of 2021 across all of the EU with whistleblower protection laws. Some of them, such as in countries like Spain, where there has been literally no standalone whistleblower protection law anywhere in Spain. In fact, what we've seen is improved cybersecurity for journalists, both in awareness of their own need for cybersecurity, training that's offered through civil society, specialist education, universities, reaching out to journalists. I set up training for journalists in the master's program at my university, and a growing awareness that the fact that the journalists not only have to defend themselves, they've got to defend their sources when it comes to the technology as well. And a lot of information laid bare so that the public is not only less deceived, but less trusting of these information companies that are linked to the defense industry, to the lies that politicians may tell us to get reelected in support of going to war yet again to cover up some financial or other malfeasance they would like the attention diverted from. And finally, and most importantly, the profound change that has happened over the last decade, whereby whistleblower is no longer a dirty word. It is no longer a dibby-dauber. It is no longer a rat. It is actually a justice seeker. And increasingly, I make the argument, and I hear it reflected back in what people are saying, that whistleblowing is seen as an emerging type of human right within the freedom of expression right that we have. UN Declaration of Human Rights. It is the right to dissent from wrongdoing. It's a right that was established not for whistleblowers per se, but for people as a whole after World War II in Europe, when we decided that no, it was not okay to just stand by and say, I didn't say anything about what I saw that was happening that was so awful. No, that wasn't acceptable, say the courts, say the people. And now we see this translated into a different mentality in how whistleblowers are viewed. And I think that WikiLeaks, and indeed these publications as a part of WikiLeaks' activities, have played a role in that transition in all of those key achievements.
Thank you, Suelette. Ian, did you want to continue there? And then we'll go to Lauri and John.
Yeah, very quick point. So Michael Clark does make very clear in his comment that he very strongly supports the work of Julian Assange and because he revealed evidence of criminal behavior by the US government in its conduct of war and other matters. So that's very important. And then he's subsequently said, what about but what happens when a whistleblower that gets it wrong, which may be the case. And in fact, there has been a recent case, quite an interesting one, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where there were two sort of the initial whistleblowers, Chris Wiley, who was briefly, I think, director of research for it. And then there was another whistleblower who, the documentary, The Great Hack, was done on Brittany Kaiser. And they both have very different versions of events, in fact, but which is quite interesting because you can sort of compare and contrast they both wrote memoirs about it. But the Information Commissioner's Office, I think late last year, published a report where basically they said, in fact, Cambridge Analytica didn't work for the Brexit campaign, for example. That was their finding, although there'd been a huge number of front page sort of stories about Cambridge Analytica's role in Brexit. The UK Information Commissioner's Office found, well, that wasn't the case. And you do get, but I think these are interesting peculiarities, but on the whole, the work of whistleblowers, if you think of the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, much of what we know about the financial crisis came from whistleblowers whose lives also were destroyed as a result of their blowing a whistle on their companies. Often they were quite senior people. If you think of so financial misconduct, military misconduct, intelligence misconduct, Edward Snowden's whistleblowing, all sorts of forms of corporate and government misconduct that we now know of, we only know of, but we know the details because of the work of whistleblowers. So you can't, it's impossible to undervalue that huge public service, the public interest whistleblowers provide to us.
Thanks, Ian. And over to you, Lauri, now for some closing comments. Lauri, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. I've got it. Yeah. So, how can I wrap up? We are aware, I think, painfully aware of the emergence of the national security state. the normalization of war, the normalization of conflicts, elective conflicts of aggression, and the subordination, the co-option of the press into supporting these. But we are aware of the countervailing tendency, and that is the wider network, the public, the networked individuals that form the polity, that form civil society, realizing that they retain a role and they can participate in this oversight capacity. Where there is a concerted will to shine the light of transparency on the doings that would prefer to be done in back rooms and in the smoky darkness where they can get away with all sorts, that concerted will bring things to light. It's we will continue to fight for Julian Assange, and I'm confident he will not be extradited, and they will not win this victory and exert this chilling effect against the public's involvement in transparency and its requirements to have transparency. But I just want to say to the powers that be and to the media that in general that I want to use the analogy of one of the pioneers of cyberspace, John Gilmore, who famously said, the network interprets censorship as damage and routes around it. And so if you're in the press, if you're willing to take on that responsibility, then the network, the internet will work with you. And if you're not willing to take on that responsibility, we'll work around you. And that's what Wikipedia did. And I'll leave with the words of my revolutionary comrade who goes by the name of Ice-T in a song that he wrote called Ain't a Damn Thing Changed. And he says, ban me, try it, you might cause a riot. What the radio won't play, the underground will supply it.
John, to you now for some final comments.
I think I'll close by saying that in 2015, Suelette hired me to help the Greek government write a new whistleblower protection law. And in my very first trip that year, in a meeting with the Minister of Justice, we were speaking in Greek, and there is no word in Greek for whistleblower. And so finally, the minister said to me, "What exactly is this word you keep using, whistleblower?" So I explained to him what I meant, and he said, like a rat or a snitch. And I said, no, not at all like a rat or a snitch. And so we had a long conversation, and we came up with the term sentinel of the public trust, which is a very pretty word in Greek. Sentinel of the public trust. And that's the word that we continued to use throughout the process. So my point here is we have a lot of work to do, a lot of work. We can't let up. We can't stop. We have to look, we're right, and we're the good guys. And so we have to keep the fight up, whether it's in support of Julian or in support of Jeremy Hammond or in support of Anonymous or WikiLeaks as an organization. We have to keep up the fight.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much. And to all those of you who, we had expected to go for 90 minutes and we've gone for slightly longer than that. Thank you for those who've stayed throughout. We haven't had a single drop in the viewing. But also, the Free the Truth events were intended to bring people like Suelette, John and Lauri to the public, to allow us to hear and understand what's really going on in the world and to look beyond the superficial narratives that are spun in some of the media, and to understand what true journalism, true whistleblowing, and the true public interest is about. And we will continue to have these events. The next event is likely to be about Guantanamo. It's a rescheduled event which was going to mark 19 years of Guantanamo being open. And so that's going to take place next. And I urge you to please follow us, follow the Don't Extradite Assange page. Please support Stella's campaign to raise funds for the defense of Julian. And first, also a big thank you to Gareth Pearce and those at Bernberg Pearce who are, and in the other legal teams, including at Doughty Street and elsewhere who are doing a huge amount of work, not at the extraordinary rates that some of these people charge, but at very reasonable rates in order to be able to push forward this case, and who've been working day and night to get Julian released. We are behind you, we support you, and we hope to see Julian amongst us and perhaps speaking at one of the Free the Truth panels very soon. And on that note, thank you to all our speakers and to the Committee to Defend Julian Assange who helped fund this Zoom, to our technical experts and to our I hesitate to call them this, but media partners who are actually retweeting and sharing the information, to all of you who are viewing and who've supported these events. And we look forward to having many more such discussions. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hasta la